On a crisp November morning in 1981, Patricia Caldwell stood in her modest kitchen in Arlington, Virginia, sorting through the day's mail with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a task she had completed 10,000 times before. Among the bills and advertising circulars, her fingers paused on a cream-colored envelope with elegant calligraphy addressing her and her husband James to the wedding of Catherine Morrison and David Chen, scheduled for the following spring. Patricia smiled at the invitation, genuinely pleased for Catherine, a bright young woman who worked as a translator at the State Department and had been their neighbor for nearly 2 years. But as Patricia set the invitation on the counter and reached for her morning coffee, something about it nagged at the edges of her consciousness, a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious melody that she could not quite identify. She picked up the invitation again, studying it more carefully this time, and in that moment of closer examination, she noticed a detail so small that most people would have overlooked it entirely. A detail that would ultimately expose one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence networks operating on American soil during the final decade of the Cold War. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Patricia Caldwell was 47 years old that autumn, a woman whose life had been shaped by attention to detail and an instinct for patterns that had served her well during 22 years working as a research analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency. Her job involved studying Soviet diplomatic communications and identifying inconsistencies that might indicate intelligence activity. She had spent decades reading cables and reports, looking for the small contradictions that revealed larger deceptions. The work had trained her mind to notice things that others missed, to recognize when something did not quite fit the expected pattern, even in contexts far removed from classified documents and intelligence assessments. James Caldwell, her husband of 25 years, worked as an engineer for a defense contractor in Roslyn, designing communication systems for military applications. His work was classified, requiring top-secret clearance and regular security reviews. They lived in a comfortable colonial house on a tree-lined street populated by other government employees and contractors, the kind of neighborhood where American flags hung from porches and everyone knew their neighbors by name. It was the sort of place where you could leave your doors unlocked and children could play outside until the streetlights came on. A pocket of suburban normalcy in a city that served as the nerve center of American power. Catherine Morrison had moved into the rental house next. Decor in early 1980, a single woman in her late 20s who explained that she had recently relocated from New York to take a position as a translator at the State Department. She spoke fluent Russian, French, and German, skills she attributed to a childhood spent moving between different countries as the daughter of an international business consultant. Catherine was friendly, but reserved, the kind of neighbor who would wave hello and chat briefly about the weather, but who rarely engaged in extended conversations or accepted invitations to neighborhood gatherings. She kept irregular hours, sometimes leaving for work before dawn and returning well after dark, a schedule she explained as the demands of translation work for diplomatic communications that operated around the clock. Patricia had liked Catherine from their first meeting. The young woman was intelligent and well-spoken, with a dry sense of humor that emerged during their occasional conversations across the fence that separated their properties. Catherine had borrowed sugar once when Patricia was baking cookies and had returned it the next day along with a handwritten thank you note on expensive stationery. She had helped Patricia carry groceries from the car during a rainstorm, declining an offer of coffee with apologetic explanations about an urgent work deadline. She seemed like exactly what she claimed to be, a hard-working young professional building a career in government service. The wedding invitation announced Catherine's engagement to David Chen, identified as a computer systems analyst at the Department of Commerce. Patricia had never met David, as Catherine rarely brought visitors to her home, maintaining a privacy that seemed appropriate for someone handling sensitive diplomatic materials. The invitation was beautifully designed, printed on heavy cardstock with embossed gold lettering, the kind of formal announcement that suggested careful planning and significant expense. Everything about it appeared perfectly normal, perfectly appropriate for a spring wedding between two young professionals starting their lives together. But something troubled Patricia as she examined the invitation more closely. The groom's name, David Chen, was followed by a parenthetical notation in smaller type that read, Chen Wei-ming. This was presumably his Chinese name, the traditional name that many Chinese Americans maintained alongside their Americanized versions. What caught Patricia's attention was the specific ordering of the Chinese name. In traditional Chinese naming conventions, the family name comes first, followed by the given name. Chen Wei-ming followed this pattern correctly, with Chen as the family name and Wei-ming as the given name. But the English version, David Chen, placed the family name second, following Western conventions. This in itself was not unusual. Many Chinese Americans adopted Western naming orders when using English. What troubled Patricia was something more subtle, something that drew on her decades of experience analyzing Soviet intelligence operations. During her career at the CIA, she had studied numerous cases of Soviet illegals, deep cover agents who assumed false identities and lived in Western countries while gathering intelligence. One consistent pattern in these operations was the meticulous attention to creating believable cover identities, including appropriate ethnic names for agents posing as immigrants or ethnic minorities. Patricia remembered a classified briefing from several years earlier about Soviet intelligence techniques for creating false identities. The instructor, a veteran counterintelligence officer, had explained that Soviet intelligence services excelled at constructing elaborate legends for their agents, complete with birth certificates, educational records, and family histories. But occasionally, these legends contained small inconsistencies that revealed themselves to careful observers. One common mistake involved naming conventions for ethnic identities, where Soviet intelligence officers unfamiliar with specific cultural practices would create names that seemed plausible but contained subtle errors that native speakers or cultural experts would recognize as wrong. Patricia set down the invitation and walked to her home office, a small room at the back of the house where she maintained files related to her work. She pulled out a reference book on Chinese naming conventions that she had used years earlier for a project analyzing Chinese diplomatic communications. She spent the next hour reading about traditional Chinese names, about the complexities of romanization systems, and about common practices among Chinese immigrants in America. What she discovered made her blood run cold. The name Chen Wei-ming, while grammatically correct in its structure, was unusual in a way that suggested someone unfamiliar with Chinese culture had constructed it. The given name Wei-ming combined two characters that were rarely used together in traditional Chinese names. Wei typically meant great or powerful, while Ming meant bsum, bright or brilliant. The combination was grammatically possible, but culturally awkward, like an English name such as Powerful Brilliant Smith. It was the kind of name someone might create by consulting a Chinese dictionary and selecting words that sounded appropriate without understanding the subtle cultural conventions that governed actual naming practices. Patricia told herself she was being ridiculous. She was seeing patterns where none existed, allowing her professional paranoia to color her judgment about a neighbor's wedding invitation. Catherine Morrison was a State Department translator, not a Soviet spy. The fact that her fiancé had an unusual Chinese name proved nothing, except perhaps that his parents had unconventional naming preferences. Patricia was manufacturing intrigue from innocent circumstances, letting her imagination transform a wedding. Invitation into evidence of espionage. But she could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the years, she had learned to trust her instincts when small details triggered her professional radar. The inconsistencies that exposed intelligence operations were rarely dramatic or obvious. They were tiny anomalies that only became significant when examined in context, when multiple small oddities accumulated into a pattern that suggested deliberate deception rather than innocent coincidence. Patricia decided to do something she knew was probably inappropriate, but felt compelled to pursue anyway. She called a colleague at the CIA, a man named Robert Driscoll, who worked in the counterintelligence division and whom she had known for 15 years. They met for coffee at a diner in Bethesda. Neutral territory, where their conversation would not attract attention from either of their employers. Patricia showed Driscoll the wedding invitation and explained her concerns about the name David Chen. As she spoke, she felt increasingly foolish, aware that she was bringing trivial suspicions about a neighbor's fiancé to a senior counterintelligence officer who dealt with genuine threats to national security. But Driscoll listened without interrupting, his expression neutral, but his attention absolute. When Patricia finished, Driscoll studied the invitation for a long moment. "You think Catherine Morrison might be a Soviet illegal?" he said. It was a statement rather than a question. "I don't know what I think," Patricia admitted. "Maybe I'm just being paranoid. Maybe I've been reading too many intelligence reports and I'm seeing threats where none exist. But something about this doesn't feel right." Driscoll tapped his finger on the invitation. "Tell me everything you know about Catherine Morrison. Every detail, no matter how insignificant it seems." Patricia spent the next hour recounting everything she had observed about her neighbor over the past 2 years. Catherine's irregular work hours, her minimal social life, the way she maintained friendly but distant relationships with everyone in the neighborhood. She described how Catherine's house always appeared neat and organized during the few times Patricia had seen inside, how Catherine never seemed to receive visitors or host gatherings, how she paid for everything in cash and drove a nondescript Honda Accord that could have belonged to anyone. None of these details were suspicious individually, but assembled together, they created a portrait of someone who existed at the margins of normal residential life. Driscoll took notes in a small leather notebook, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific observations. "Has she ever mentioned her family?" Driscoll asked. "Parents, siblings, childhood memories?" Patricia thought carefully. "She mentioned her father was an international business consultant, but she's never been specific about what kind of business or where he worked. She said she grew up moving between different countries, but she's never named specific places or told stories about her childhood in a way that felt detailed or personal." Driscoll nodded slowly. "And the State Department translator position, have you ever verified that independently?" "No," Patricia said. "I just accepted what she told me. She keeps odd hours that would be consistent with diplomatic work, and she carries herself like someone with security clearance. I never had any reason to doubt her." Driscoll closed his notebook. "Patricia, I want you to understand something. What you've brought me is not proof of anything. It's a collection of observations that could have innocent explanations. But you're right that the pattern is concerning. Soviet intelligence has been placing illegals in the United States for decades, and many of them work very hard to establish apparently normal lives in exactly the kind of neighborhoods where you live. If Catherine Morrison is an illegal, she would be trained to maintain a cover identity that appears completely legitimate while actually serving the KGB or GRU. "So what happens now?" Patricia asked. "Now I do some very quiet checking," Driscoll replied. "I'll verify whether Catherine Morrison actually works for the State Department. I'll look into the background she's provided and see if there are any inconsistencies in her story. And I'll have someone check into David Chen and see if he actually exists and works where the invitation says he works. If everything checks out, then you can go to the wedding with a clear conscience and forget we ever had this conversation. But if there are problems, if her story doesn't hold up under scrutiny, then we have a much more serious situation to deal with." Patricia returned home, feeling both relieved and anxious. She had reported her concerns to someone with the authority to investigate properly, but she had also potentially set in motion a process that could destroy her neighbor's life if Patricia's suspicions proved unfounded. That evening, as she prepared dinner and listened to James talk about a problem with a communications system he was designing, Patricia found herself distracted, her mind returning again and again to the wedding invitation sitting on the kitchen counter. Over the next 3 weeks, Patricia heard nothing from Driscoll. She went about her normal routine, commuting to CIA headquarters in Langley, analyzing intelligence reports, attending meetings with colleagues who had no idea that she had potentially identified a Soviet intelligence operation in her own neighborhood. She waved to Catherine when they happened to be outside at the same time, exchanged brief pleasantries about the approaching holidays, gave no indication that anything had changed. But everything had changed. Patricia found herself watching Catherine with new awareness, noting details she had previously overlooked. She observed that Catherine never received mail beyond the occasional catalog or utility bill, nothing personal that would indicate family connections or a social network beyond her immediate work environment. She noticed that Catherine's trash, visible on collection days, contained mostly prepared food packaging and very few of the accumulated possessions that most people discarded regularly: magazines, junk mail, broken household items. Catherine's life appeared almost ascetic in its minimalism, as though she maintained only the absolute necessities required to support her cover identity. 3 days before Thanksgiving, Driscoll called Patricia at work and asked her to meet him at the same diner in Bethesda. She drove there with her heart pounding, knowing that Driscoll would not have requested the meeting unless his investigation had uncovered something significant. They sat in the same booth they had occupied during their previous meeting. Driscoll looked tired, his face drawn with tension. "Catherine Morrison does work for the State Department," he began. "She's been employed there for 18 months as a contract translator specializing in Russian and Eastern European languages. Her security clearance is legitimate, her background check passed all standard reviews, and she has access to diplomatic communications as part of her translation duties." Patricia felt a wave of relief mixed with confusion. "So I was wrong. She's exactly who she claims to be." "Not exactly," Driscoll said carefully. "The problem is that everything about Catherine Morrison's background, while officially documented and verified, has a quality that concerns our counterintelligence specialists. Her educational records exist, but they're from institutions that are difficult to verify independently. Her work history before joining the State Department consists of freelance translation work for clients who either no longer exist or can't remember her specifically. Her birth certificate and social security number are legitimate, but they were issued in circumstances that are difficult to trace definitively." "What does that mean?" Patricia asked, though she already suspected the answer. "It means that Catherine Morrison's identity appears to have been carefully constructed by professionals who understood how to create documentation that would pass routine background checks, but that begins to fall apart under intensive scrutiny. Everything about her background is technically correct, but nothing about it feels authentically lived. It's like a stage set that looks convincing from the audience but reveals itself as artificial when you examine it closely. Driscoll opened his notebook and flipped through several pages of notes. And then there's David Chen. We've verified that someone by that name works for the Department of Commerce's Computer Systems Division, but when we tried to contact him to verify information for an unrelated security matter, we discovered something interesting. David Chen has no social security number issued before 1979. His college transcripts exist, but come from a university in California that had a fire in its records building that year, requiring many documents to be reconstructed from OS backup sources. His driver's license and other identification are legitimate, but they all originate from a concentrated period in late 1979 and early 1980. Patricia felt ice water flooding through her veins. You're saying both of them are illegals, Soviet intelligence officers operating under false identities. We're saying that both identities show characteristics consistent with Soviet illegal programs, Driscoll corrected. We don't have proof yet, but we have enough anomalies to warrant opening a formal counterintelligence investigation. The wedding invitation you showed me has become the foundation for what could be a significant operation to identify and neutralize a Soviet intelligence network. Over the next several weeks, Patricia learned to live with the knowledge that her neighbor was likely a foreign intelligence officer while maintaining the appearance of normal, friendly relations. FBI counterintelligence teams established surveillance on Catherine Morrison's house, documenting her movements and identifying her contacts. Patricia was instructed to behave exactly as she had before, to give no indication that anything had changed, to continue being the friendly neighbor who occasionally chatted over the back fence. The surveillance revealed patterns that confirmed the worst suspicions. Catherine Morrison was observed making contact with at least 4 other individuals who demonstrated similar characteristics of deep cover operatives. She used classic tradecraft techniques, brush passes in crowded locations, dead drops in parks, counter-surveillance driving patterns designed to detect anyone following her. Most significantly, she was observed using a burst transmitter to send encrypted messages, communications that were tracked to a Soviet diplomatic facility in New York. David Chen proved equally interesting under surveillance. He was documented accessing computer systems at the Department of Commerce and copying files onto portable storage media that he then transported to meetings with Catherine Morrison. The files contained information about American economic data, trade negotiations, and technology export controls, intelligence that would be valuable to Soviet economic planners and strategic decision-makers. But Catherine and David were just the beginning. The FBI's investigation, which had started with Patricia's observation about a name on a wedding invitation, expanded to identify what appeared to be an entire network of Soviet illegals operating in the Washington area. The wedding itself seemed designed to serve as a meet for multiple operatives who would gather under the cover of a social celebration, allowing them to exchange information and receive instructions from handlers without attracting the attention that individual meetings might generate. In January of 1982, Patricia received another call from Driscoll. We've identified 7 individuals connected to Morrison and Chen who appear to be part of the same network, he told her during a meeting at the now familiar diner in Bethesda. 3 work in government agencies with access to classified information. 2 are embedded in defense contractors. 1 works at a think tank that produces policy analysis for the Pentagon. And 1 operates a travel agency that we believe is used for communication purposes and to facilitate the movement of other operatives. Are you going to arrest them? Patricia asked. Not yet, Driscoll replied. Right now we're conducting what we call a double-agent operation. We've identified the network, but instead of arresting everyone immediately, we're feeding them carefully prepared information through channels they believe are secure. We're letting them think their operations are successful while actually controlling what intelligence flows back to Moscow. This allows us to understand Soviet intelligence priorities and to deceive them about American capabilities and intentions. Patricia absorbed this information with a mixture of fascination and unease. So Catherine will continue living next door to me. I'll continue waving hello and making small talk, while knowing she's a Soviet spy, and while she's being fed false information by the FBI. Exactly, Driscoll confirmed. And we need you to continue behaving completely normally. If Morrison suspects that she's been compromised, the entire operation falls apart. Your role in this is crucial, Patricia. You need to be the friendly neighbor who knows nothing, who suspects nothing, who is looking forward to attending her wedding and celebrating her happiness. The wedding was scheduled for late April 1982, and as the date approached, Patricia found herself living in two parallel realities. In one reality, she was simply a neighbor attending the wedding of a friendly young woman, shopping for an appropriate gift, discussing with James what they should wear, making arrangements with other neighbors to carpool to the ceremony and reception. In the other reality, she was part of a sophisticated counterintelligence operation, aware that the wedding would be surveilled by dozens of FBI agents, that every guest would be photographed and identified, that the entire celebration was actually an intelligence operation disguised as a social event. The wedding took place on a beautiful spring Saturday at a hotel in Georgetown. Patricia and James arrived with other neighbors from their street, all of them dressed in their finest clothes and carrying carefully wrapped gifts. The ceremony was traditional, with Catherine looking radiant in an elegant white gown and David Chen handsome in a tailored tuxedo. They exchanged vows before a judge who had no idea that the couple before him were Soviet intelligence officers, whose real names were likely something entirely different from the identities they had assumed. Patricia sat in the audience, watching Catherine promise to love and honor David Chen for the rest of her life, and wondered if anything about this moment was genuine. Did Catherine feel any real emotion as she spoke her vows? Or was this simply another performance, another element of the elaborate deception she had maintained for years? Patricia found herself hoping that some part of Catherine's emotions were real, that even foreign intelligence officers could experience love and connection despite the lies that defined their professional lives. The reception was held in a ballroom decorated with spring flowers and elegant table settings. Patricia and James sat with other neighbors, making polite conversation and sampling the catered meal. Patricia noticed several guests who seemed slightly out of place, men and women whose attentiveness to their surroundings suggested professional training in observation. These were the FBI surveillance teams, she realized, integrated into the wedding as apparently normal guests, while actually documenting every person present and every interaction that occurred. She watched as Catherine and David Chen moved through the reception, greeting guests, posing for photographs, performing the rituals expected of newlyweds. And she watched as certain guests engaged in brief conversations with the bride and groom. Conversations that looked casual, but that Patricia suspected involved the exchange of intelligence or instructions. The wedding was exactly what Driscoll had suggested it would be, an intelligence operation disguised as a social celebration, a gathering that allowed multiple operatives to meet and communicate under circumstances that would appear completely innocent to any outside observer. Patricia danced with James during the reception, moving slowly to music played by a small band while maintaining pleasant conversation with other couples on the dance floor. But her mind was elsewhere, thinking about the elaborate deception unfolding around her, about the lives built on lies, and the damage that would eventually come when the lies collapsed. The FBI allowed the network to continue operating for another 6 months after the wedding, using the time to document the full extent of Soviet intelligence activities and to feed carefully prepared disinformation through channels the Soviets believed were secure. Patricia learned later that information passed through Catherine Morrison and David Chen had influenced Soviet military planning and economic policy, leading Soviet leaders to make strategic decisions based on false assessments of American capabilities. The arrests came on a cold morning in November 1982, exactly 1 year after Patricia had first noticed the unusual name on the wedding invitation. FBI agents moved simultaneously against all 7 members of the network, executing search warrants and taking the operatives into custody before any of them could destroy evidence or alert Moscow that they had been compromised. Patricia was at work when she received a phone call from Driscoll informing her that Catherine Morrison had been arrested at her State Department office. "We found encrypted communications equipment in her house," Driscoll told her, along with multiple sets of false identification documents, sophisticated radio transmission gear, and coded instructions from her handlers in Moscow. She's being charged with espionage and conspiracy to commit espionage. That evening, when Patricia returned home, she saw FBI vehicles parked in front of Catherine's house. Agents were loading boxes of evidence into trucks while neighbors stood in their yards, watching in stunned confusion. Patricia parked her car and walked over to where James stood talking with another neighbor. "Can you believe it?" the neighbor was saying. "Catherine Morrison was a Soviet spy, right here in our neighborhood, living next door to us for 2 years. Who would have thought it?" Patricia said nothing. She simply stood and watched as agents carried box after box of evidence from the house where Catherine Morrison had constructed an entire false life, maintained a cover identity that had fooled almost everyone who encountered her. The only reason Catherine's operation had been exposed was because Patricia had noticed a small inconsistency on a wedding invitation, a name that didn't quite fit the expected pattern, a detail so minor that 999 people out of 1,000 would have overlooked it entirely. The case made national news when it went to trial several months later. Catherine Morrison, whose real name was revealed to be Ekaterina Volkov, pleaded guilty to espionage charges in exchange for cooperation with American intelligence services. David Chen was actually Dmitry Sokolov, and he too pleaded guilty and provided information about Soviet intelligence methods and operations. The other 5 members of the network received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years in federal prison. Patricia's role in identifying the network remained classified. She received a commendation from the CIA director, presented in a private ceremony attended only by senior counterintelligence officials. The letter praised her exceptional observational skills and analytical judgment that had led to the exposure of a significant Soviet intelligence operation. But the commendation was classified at the secret level, filed away in secure storage, where it would likely remain for decades. The most difficult aspect for Patricia was the knowledge that she had destroyed the life of someone she had genuinely liked. Despite knowing that Catherine Morrison was a false identity, despite understanding that Ekaterina Volkov had been systematically stealing American secrets, Patricia could not completely suppress her memory of the friendly neighbor who had borrowed sugar and helped carry groceries in the rain. The human being had been real, even if the identity she presented had been a carefully constructed fiction. Years later, after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, Patricia occasionally wondered what had become of Ekaterina Volkov. She learned through declassified documents that Volkov and several other captured Soviet illegals had been exchanged for American intelligence officers held by the Soviets, that they had returned to Moscow, where they were likely given new assignments or retired from active service. Patricia wondered if Volkov ever thought about her time as Catherine Morrison, about the neighbor who had noticed a small inconsistency on a wedding invitation, and set in motion the unraveling of an entire intelligence network. The wedding invitation itself was preserved as evidence, eventually finding its way into the archives of American counterintelligence history. The cream-colored card, with its elegant calligraphy and embossed gold lettering, represented one of the most unlikely breakthroughs in Cold War espionage, a reminder that sophisticated intelligence operations could be undone by something as simple as a name that didn't quite sound right to someone with the training and experience to recognize the discrepancy. Patricia Caldwell continued working at the CIA for another decade, retiring in 1992 after the Cold War had definitively ended. During those final years, she occasionally served as a consultant on counterintelligence matters, sharing her experiences with younger analysts who were learning to identify the subtle patterns that indicated deception. She would show them the wedding invitation, explaining how one small anomaly had led to a major counterintelligence success, emphasizing that the most important skill an intelligence analyst could develop was simply paying attention to details that others overlooked. The lesson Patricia emphasized in these briefings was that espionage operations, no matter how sophisticated, ultimately depended on human beings who made mistakes. Soviet intelligence had invested enormous resources in creating the identities of Catherine Morrison and David Chen, producing documentation that passed routine background checks and establishing cover identities that appeared completely legitimate. But they had made one small error in constructing David Chen's Chinese name, an error so minor that it would be invisible to anyone without specific knowledge of Chinese naming conventions. That single mistake, noticed by someone with the right background and training, had exposed an entire network. The story became something of a legend within CIA counterintelligence circles, cited in training programs as an example of how analytical rigor and attention to detail could achieve results that technical surveillance and sophisticated investigative techniques might miss. The wedding invitation that exposed a Soviet spy cell represented the human factor in intelligence work, the reality that even in an era of advanced technology and elaborate tradecraft, the most decisive breakthroughs sometimes came from someone who simply noticed that something wasn't quite right. Patricia never spoke publicly about her role in the case. The details remained classified long after the participants had retired or died, protected by security regulations that outlived the Cold War itself. Her neighbors never learned that the friendly woman next door had worked for the CIA, that she had exposed a Soviet spy network, that her analytical skills had contributed to American intelligence successes. She lived out her retirement in the same house on the same street in Arlington, tending her garden and spending time with her grandchildren, carrying knowledge that could never be shared outside secure facilities and classified briefings. But on quiet evenings, when she sat on her back porch and looked at the house where Catherine Morrison had once lived, now occupied by a young family who knew nothing of its history, Patricia would remember that November morning in 1981, when a wedding invitation had troubled her professional instincts. She would remember the choice she had made to trust those instincts despite self-doubt, to report her concerns despite the risk of appearing paranoid, to pursue an investigation that could easily have come to nothing. The Cold War had produced countless stories of espionage and betrayal, of elaborate operations and spectacular failures, but it had also produced quieter stories like Patricia's, stories of ordinary people whose specialized knowledge and careful observation had contributed to national security in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged. These stories rarely appeared in history books or intelligence memoirs. They existed instead in classified files, known only to the small community of professionals who understood their significance. Patricia Caldwell's contribution to Cold War counterintelligence ultimately rested on three things: her professional training in analyzing patterns and identifying inconsistencies, her willingness to trust her instincts when something seemed wrong, and her courage in reporting her suspicions despite uncertainty about whether they were valid. The wedding invitation had been the catalyst, the small detail that triggered her professional awareness. But the real breakthrough had come from Patricia's decision to act on what she observed, to take her concerns to someone who could investigate properly, rather than dismissing them as paranoid imagination. The house where Ekaterina Volkov had lived as Catherine Morrison stood as a quiet monument to the reality that the Cold War had been fought not just in Berlin and Moscow and Washington's corridors of power, but also in suburban neighborhoods where Soviet illegals had constructed false lives and worked to steal American secrets. Patricia's story demonstrated that defending against such operations required not just the resources of intelligence agencies, but also the vigilance of citizens who understood their responsibilities and possessed the courage to act when they recognized threats. And it all began with a wedding invitation, an elegant cream-colored card with embossed gold lettering announcing a celebration that was actually an intelligence operation, a name that didn't quite sound right to someone with the training to recognize the discrepancy, and a decision by one analyst to trust her instincts and report what she had observed, setting in motion a counterintelligence operation that would ultimately expose an entire Soviet spy network operating in the heart of the American capital. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.